The evening of August 30th, 1918, settled over Moscow like a wool blanket soaked in rain. The city smelled of gunpowder and anxiety, not metaphorically, but literally. For months, the Bolshevik government had been bleeding from every wound simultaneously. The civil war grinding in the east, German pressure from the west, bread riots in the provinces, and a growing chorus of political enemies who believed the revolution had been stolen from its rightful heirs. It was not a safe time to be Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. It was not, as it turned out, a safe evening to stand beside his automobile in the courtyard of the Michelson factory in Zamysk-Voriki. But Lenin went anyway. This is the first thing you need to understand about that night. Nobody had to send him there. Lenin was many things. Calculating, dogmatic, ruthless in ways that history would eventually reckon with. But he was also a man who believed in the power of personal presence. He believed workers needed to see their leader. He had spoken at factories before, many times, often without significant security arrangements. In the chaotic early months of Soviet power, when the administrative apparatus was still being assembled from spare parts and revolutionary enthusiasm, this was not unusual. What was unusual, what was, in retrospect, almost incomprehensible, was that on this particular evening, on this particular day, after what had already happened that morning in Petrograd, Lenin arrived at the Michelson factory with almost no protection at all. That morning, Moise Uritsky had been shot dead. Uritsky was the head of the Petrograd Chayka, the secret police organ that Felix Dzerzhinsky had built into the iron fist of Bolshevik security. His assassination, carried out by a young poet named Leonid Kanagisser, sent shockwaves through the party leadership. Here was a senior Bolshevik official, the chief security man of Russia's second city, gunned down in broad daylight. Logic, simple, elementary logic, dictated that every other senior official in the country should immediately have their security doubled, tripled. The wolves were clearly at the door. Lenin's security detail that evening consisted of his driver. This is not a minor detail. This is not a footnote. This is the first crack in the official story, and it runs deep enough to swallow everything that came after. How does the most important man in Soviet Russia, on the day that one of his closest colleagues has just been assassinated, travel to a public factory meeting with essentially no protection? Who made that decision? Who was responsible for the security arrangements, or rather, for the stunning absence of them? We will return to that question. For now, let us stay in the courtyard. The meeting itself ran long, as Lenin's meetings often did. He spoke with the intensity he always brought to workers' gatherings, the sharp, clipped sentences, the rhetorical questions fired like small artillery rounds, the way he had of making a factory floor feel like the center of the universe. The crowd was several hundred strong. They pressed close, as crowds always did with Lenin, wanting proximity to the legend. When the speech ended, he moved toward his automobile through a knot of people. 3 shots were fired. 2 bullets struck Lenin, one in the shoulder, one in the neck, dangerously close to the spine. A 3rd bullet struck a woman standing nearby. Lenin collapsed. His driver, Alexander Gill, caught him. The crowd erupted into the particular kind of chaos that only an assassination attempt can produce. Screaming, running, people throwing themselves to the ground, others freezing in place, nobody quite certain where the shots had come from or whether more were coming. In the confusion, approximately 100 meters from the automobile, a woman was seized. Her name was Fanny Kaplan. She was 28 years old, a socialist revolutionary, a member of the party that had once been the Bolsheviks' most serious rival for revolutionary legitimacy and was now their most dangerous internal enemy. She was found carrying a briefcase and an umbrella. She had not been observed firing a weapon. No one in the crowd would subsequently testify to having seen her shoot. But she was there, she was a known political opponent, and when she was taken to the local police station and questioned, she said the words that would seal her fate and define the official narrative for the next century. I shot Lenin. I shot him because I considered him a traitor to the revolution. Case closed. Except, of course, it was not. Because the moment you begin to pull at the threads of that confession, the moment you ask the questions that any serious detective, any competent investigator, any journalist with a basic respect for evidence would immediately ask, the entire fabric begins to come apart in your hands. Start with the simplest question. Could Fanny Kaplan actually have fired those shots? Kaplan's history was not a secret. She had been a revolutionary since adolescence, had been arrested for a bombing operation in Kiev in 1908, and had spent a decade in the labor camps of Siberia, specifically in the Akatui prison, one of the harshest in the Tsarist penal system. The conditions there were extraordinary in their brutality. By the time she was released following the February Revolution of 1917, she had been partially blinded. Medical examinations at the time recorded a diagnosis of hysterical blindness, a functional vision loss brought on by the psychological and physical trauma of imprisonment. She could see shapes and movement, but detail was largely lost to her. Now picture the courtyard of the Michelson factory at approximately 11 o'clock at night. There are no floodlights. The only illumination comes from whatever ambient light filters through the factory windows and the early autumn sky. A crowd of several hundred people is milling around, talking, beginning to disperse. Lenin is moving through them, not standing still at a podium, but moving, surrounded by bodies. The target is partially obscured, in motion, at close but not trivial range, in near darkness. A trained marksman with excellent vision would find this shot difficult. Fanny Kaplan, by documented medical record, could barely see. 2 bullets found their mark with enough precision to nearly kill one of the most consequential political figures in the world. Both struck Lenin in the upper body, the shoulder and the neck, in what any ballistics expert would describe as a grouping that suggests either extraordinary luck or practiced skill. Does this match a half-blind woman firing in darkness? The investigators in 1918 did not ask this question. Or rather, if they asked it, they did not allow the answer to interfere with their conclusions. Kaplan had confessed. There were political pressures of enormous magnitude, pushing toward a rapid resolution. The attack on Lenin needed an explanation, needed a face, needed a narrative that the government could use. Kaplan provided all three. She was a socialist revolutionary, and the socialist revolutionaries were the enemy the Bolsheviks most needed to destroy at that moment. Her guilt was not merely convenient. It was, from a certain political perspective, almost necessary. She was executed 4 days after her arrest. No trial. No formal judicial process. On the direct verbal order of Yakov Sverdlov, chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, the second most powerful man in Soviet Russia, Kaplan was taken to the garage of the Kremlin commandant's office and shot. Her body was then burned in a barrel. The physical evidence, such as it was, ceased to exist. Think about that sequence for a moment. You have a woman who has confessed to one of the most significant political crimes in the history of the new Soviet state, an attempted assassination of the revolutionary leader himself. In any legitimate legal system, such a confession would trigger an exhaustive investigation. Who recruited her? Who provided the weapon? Who gave the order? Who else knew? These are not optional questions. These are the essential questions, the questions that distinguish solving a crime from simply closing a file. Instead, Fanny Kaplan was dead in 96 hours. There is a principle in criminal investigation, ancient, almost instinctive in experienced detectives, that the speed with which a case is closed is inversely proportional to the desire for the truth to emerge. Fast closures protect someone. They draw a line and say, this far, and no further. The execution of Kaplan drew exactly such a line. But even before she was gone, the anomalies had begun to accumulate. The murder weapon, a Browning pistol, was not found at the scene on the night of August 30th. It did not appear until 3 days later, produced by a man named Kuznetsov, about whom the historical record is frustratingly vague. Chain of custody, that bedrock principle of evidentiary integrity, was entirely absent. The weapon that allegedly put 2 bullets into Lenin arrived late, through unclear hands, and was accepted without apparent scrutiny. Meanwhile, something else had already happened, something that, once you notice it, cannot be unnoticed. The official announcement from the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, signed by Yakov Sverdlov, condemning the attack and calling for revolutionary vengeance, was issued so quickly after the shots were fired that the timestamps do not align with the timeline as the driver Gil later recounted it. The document that announced the attack on Lenin appeared to exist before the attack was fully confirmed, before the chaos in the courtyard had resolved itself into a coherent sequence of events that could have been transmitted, processed, and turned into an official statement. Documents, as any archivist will tell you, do not write themselves. They require information, intention, and time. The Sverdlov announcement required all three, and the mathematics of the evening suggest that at least some of that preparation happened before the shots were fired. This is where the investigation truly begins. Because August 30th, 1918, was not simply a day when a half-blind woman tried to kill Vladimir Lenin and very nearly succeeded. It was a day when two senior Bolsheviks were attacked within hours of each other, in different cities, by different perpetrators, with different weapons. It was a day when the leader of Soviet Russia had traveled to a public event without meaningful security, despite having just received news of a colleague's murder. It was a day when the investigation into what happened concluded with extraordinary speed and extraordinary incuriosity. It was, in other words, a day that raised far more questions than it answered. The official history gave the Soviet people Fanny Kaplan, a fanatical socialist revolutionary, half-mad with ideological obsession, who raised her pistol in the darkness of a factory courtyard and tried to kill the revolution's greatest son. It was a clean story. It had a villain with a face and a name and a motive. It had a martyred leader who survived through revolutionary destiny. It launched the Red Terror, a campaign of mass repression that would kill tens of thousands, on the most powerful possible moral foundation. They tried to kill Lenin. But clean stories, in history as in crime fiction, are almost always invented. What actually happened in that courtyard on the evening of August 30th, 1918? The answer, buried beneath decades of Soviet archival management and political mythology, is far more disturbing than anything the official narrative ever suggested. There is a moment in every serious investigation when the weight of accumulated doubt becomes impossible to ignore. It is not a single revelation, rarely is it ever one dramatic fact that breaks a case open. It is instead the slow, relentless pressure of contradictions stacking one upon another, each individually dismissible, together forming a structure so unstable that the official narrative can no longer support its own weight. The case against Fanny Kaplan reached that moment long ago. The Soviet state closed the file in 1918 with the speed of a man who does not want to look at what he has buried. For decades, the story remained sealed beneath layers of ideological concrete. Kaplan shot Lenin. Kaplan was executed. The socialist revolutionaries were proven enemies of the revolution. End of discussion. To question this version in the Soviet Union was not merely academically unfashionable, it was existentially dangerous. The archives were locked. The witnesses were dead. The barrel in which Kaplan's body was burned left no evidence to examine. But archives eventually open. Witnesses leave memoirs. And the internal logic of a fabricated story always contains the seeds of its own destruction. Here are the 5 contradictions at the heart of the Kaplan case. 5 structural failures in the official narrative that, taken together, point not toward a lone assassin acting on ideological conviction, but toward something far more calculated and far more sinister. We have already touched on this, but it demands fuller examination, because the medical evidence here is not ambiguous or open to interpretation. It is documented, specific, and devastating to the prosecution's case. Fanny Kaplan had been imprisoned in the Akatui hard labor camp for approximately 10 years following her arrest in 1908. The conditions in that facility were among the most punishing in the entire Tsarist penal system. Cold that cracked wood, labor that broke bodies, isolation that fractured minds. By the time she emerged following the February Revolution, prison doctors and subsequent civilian physicians had noted a consistent finding: Kaplan suffered from severely compromised vision. The clinical language used was hysterical blindness, a term that, in the medical vocabulary of the early 20th century, described a functional impairment of vision caused by severe neurological and psychological trauma rather than structural damage to the eye itself. What this meant practically was that Fanny Kaplan could not see clearly at distance. She could perceive movement, distinguish light from shadow, navigate a room without walking into furniture. But detailed visual perception, the kind required to identify a specific individual in a crowd, to track a moving target, to aim a pistol with sufficient precision to place 2 bullets in the upper body of a man surrounded by hundreds of people, was largely unavailable to her. Now consider the shooting itself with fresh eyes. 2 bullets struck Lenin. One entered his left shoulder, passed through, and exited near the collarbone. The second struck him in the neck, passed close enough to the carotid artery and the spine that physicians who examined him would spend the next several years debating whether removing it posed greater risk than leaving it in place. It remained in his body until his death in 1924, and some medical historians believe it contributed to the strokes that killed him. A third bullet struck a bystander. This is not random fire into a crowd. This is concentrated fire on a specific target, 2 hits out of 3 shots, both in the upper body of one individual moving through a dense crowd in near darkness. The shooting was carried out at approximately 11 o'clock at night in a factory courtyard. The available light was minimal, factory windows, perhaps a vehicle lamp, the diffuse glow of a Russian late summer sky. In these conditions, a person with normal vision firing at a moving target within a crowd of hundreds would find the shot extremely difficult. For a person with documented severe visual impairment, placing 2 bullets with that degree of accuracy approaches the statistically impossible. Professional investigators call this the first question they would ask. How did she do it? Not in a rhetorical sense, in a forensic sense. Show me the mechanism by which this half-blind woman, in this light, at this distance, in this crowd, achieved this result. No one in 1918 asked the question. The confession made it unnecessary. But a confession without corroborating physical evidence is not proof. It is a statement, and statements can be coerced, scripted, or given for reasons entirely unrelated to guilt. Fanny Kaplan was shot on the 4th day after her arrest. September 3, 1918. Let us be precise about what this means procedurally. She was arrested on the evening of August 30th. She was interrogated over the following days, during which she maintained her confession but provided investigators with remarkably little actionable information about collaborators, planning, or logistics. Then, on the verbal order of Yakov Sverdlov, not a written decree, not a judicial finding, not the result of any formal legal process, she was taken to a garage within the Kremlin walls and executed. Her body was then placed in a metal barrel and burned. In 1918, even within the Bolshevik legal framework, this procedure was extraordinary. The Soviet state had its own revolutionary tribunals, summary certainly, and capable of great speed and tremendous injustice, but they existed. They had procedures. They produced records. In cases of significant political importance, they were used precisely because they generated the documentation and the public legitimacy that the new government needed to justify its actions. The trial of the social revolutionaries in 1922, for example, was a major public proceeding, extensively documented, internationally observed. Fanny Kaplan, the woman who allegedly tried to kill Lenin himself, received no trial of any kind. Not even a summary tribunal. She was disposed of on a verbal order within 96 hours of the event she supposedly orchestrated. This is how you treat a witness you need to silence, not a criminal you need to punish. Punishment, in politically significant cases, requires demonstration, public proceedings, documented confessions, the theatrical apparatus of revolutionary justice that the Bolsheviks were quite willing to deploy when it served their purposes. Punishment of a woman who tried to kill Lenin should have been the most visible, most documented, most elaborately staged act of revolutionary justice imaginable. It should have been a show trial before the show trials existed. Instead, it was a barrel and a match in a Kremlin garage. The speed and the secrecy answer a specific question. What happened to the thing that Kaplan might have said if given time and a formal proceeding to say it? What names might have emerged? What version of events might she have offered that differed from the one the state required? We will never know. The burning of her body ensured that we would never know. In the logic of criminal investigation, eliminating a principal witness before they can testify in any formal context is a profound red flag. It does not prove a conspiracy, but it demands explanation, an explanation that the Soviet state never provided and that its archivists spent decades ensuring no one would seek. The entire edifice of the prosecution's case rested on one thing: Kaplan's confession. There were no eyewitness accounts of her firing the weapon. This is extraordinary given the circumstances. Several hundred people were present in that courtyard. Many of them were watching Lenin closely, as audiences at political rallies tend to watch the speaker even after the speech has ended. The moment the shots were fired, every person in that space became a potential witness to the location and identity of the shooter. Investigators subsequently interviewed numerous people who had been present. Not one of them testified to having seen Fanny Kaplan fire a gun. This absence is not simply a bureaucratic gap or an archival failure. It is a substantive evidentiary problem. A shooter in a crowd of hundreds, firing 3 times, produces a physical spectacle: muzzle flash, sound directionality, the involuntary human response of looking toward the source of sudden loud noise. People see shooters. They remember them. The witnesses at the Michelson factory, interrogated in the immediate aftermath of the event, could not place a weapon in Kaplan's hands. What they could say was that she had been in the vicinity, that she was found nearby, that she was behaving in ways that seemed suspicious in retrospect, though retrospect is doing enormous work in that sentence, since what seemed suspicious after an assassination attempt often seemed entirely unremarkable before it. She was standing near the car. She may have been in the crowd. She was arrested. And then she confessed. A confession, in the absence of all physical and witness corroboration, is the weakest possible form of evidence, particularly when the confessor is a politically committed revolutionary who might have had her own reasons for claiming responsibility. Some historians have suggested that Kaplan may have believed she was involved in some way, that she was told she was part of an operation, was given a role that kept her near the scene, and that when the shots were fired and chaos erupted, she claimed the action as her own out of revolutionary conviction, regardless of whether her hand had actually held the weapon. If that is true, she was not a gunman. She was a cover story that consented to its own role. Evidence management is one of the most fundamental disciplines in criminal investigation. The chain of custody, the documented sequence of who possessed a piece of evidence, when, and under what circumstances, exists for precisely one reason: to ensure that the evidence presented in proceedings actually connects to the crime it supposedly proves. In the Kaplan case, the murder weapon did not exist on the night of August 30th. Searches of the scene, searches of Kaplan herself, the immediate processing of physical evidence at the courtyard of the Michelson factory, none of this produced a firearm. The weapon that fired the shots that nearly killed Lenin was not found when it should have been found, immediately, at or near the scene, in connection with the person being held as the shooter. 3 days later, a Browning pistol appeared. It was brought in by a man identified as Kuznetsov. The historical record on Kuznetsov is sparse to the point of being suspicious in itself. Who he was, what his connection to the case was, why he had the weapon, how it came into his possession, none of this was documented with any rigor. The pistol was accepted and entered into the record as the weapon used in the shooting. No serious forensic work connected this specific pistol to the bullets recovered from Lenin's body in any way that the available records demonstrate. The gun arrived late, through uncertain hands, and was incorporated into the evidence base without the scrutiny that the circumstances demanded. A weapon that cannot be placed at the scene on the night of the crime, that surfaces days later through a murky chain of possession, that is attributed to a suspect already in custody. This is not evidence. This is a prop. And props are placed by people who need the story to hold together after the fact. In 1922, a man named Gregory Semyonov published a memoir. Semyonov had been the commander of the Central Combat Detachment of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. In his book he described, with a specificity that left little room for ambiguity, his role in organizing the attack on Lenin on August 30th, 1918. He placed himself at the center of the operations planning. He acknowledged that his organization had prepared the action. He had been arrested in October 1918, less than 2 months after the shooting. He was not executed. He was not sentenced to a lengthy term in prison. He was released, given full amnesty, and subsequently employed as a staff officer in Soviet military intelligence. His colleague Lydia Konopleva, who had also participated in the planning of the assassination attempt, was similarly arrested, similarly sentenced, and similarly released. Both of them built careers within Soviet institutions, careers that continued until 1937, when Stalin's purges consumed them along with most of the old Bolsheviks and many of their associates. Sit with that for a moment. The man who organized the assassination attempt on Lenin was arrested, released, given a party card, and put to work in intelligence. The woman who worked alongside him received the same treatment. Neither faced serious consequences for their participation in an act that the Soviet state officially described as the most dangerous counter-revolutionary crime in its history. There is exactly one explanation for this that withstands scrutiny. You do not give a party card and an intelligence posting to the man who tried to kill the revolution's greatest leader. You do not do this out of mercy, or pragmatism, or revolutionary magnanimity. You do it because the man did not betray you. You do it because the man worked for you. You do it because his loyalty to your organization, not to the socialist revolutionaries, but to you, to the apparatus that actually gave the orders, was demonstrated through his participation in the operation itself. Semyonov was not a socialist revolutionary who somehow escaped punishment. Semyonov was an agent who completed his assignment and was rewarded accordingly. The socialist revolutionary label was the cover, the ideological packaging that made the attack legible to the public as the work of an enemy, rather than the work of someone operating from within the Bolshevik security structure itself. Taken individually, each of these 5 points might be explained away. Vision impairment does not make an accurate shot impossible, only unlikely. Fast executions, while brutal, occurred in that period for various reasons. Confessions without witnesses were not unheard of. Evidence management was chaotic in 1918. Amnesty could be granted for political reasons. But these 5 contradictions do not exist individually. They exist together as a system, each one reinforcing the others, all of them pointing in the same direction. A shooter who could not have made the shots. A witness eliminated before she could speak formally. A case that rested entirely on an unverifiable confession. A weapon that materialized days later through unknown hands. And the supposed organizer of the plot rewarded with a career in intelligence. This is not a collection of coincidences. This is a pattern. And patterns, in the language of investigation, have authors. The question of who authored this particular pattern, who designed the operation, who positioned the pieces, who sent Fanny Kaplan to stand near Lenin's automobile on the evening of August 30th, leads us directly to the most powerful office in the Soviet state in the autumn of 1918. And the man sitting in that office had been very, very busy that evening. Power, in its most naked form, is not about what you do when a crisis arrives. It is about what you do in the seconds and minutes immediately after. Who you call, what orders you give, which rooms you walk into, and which chairs you sit down in. In the chaos following a catastrophic event, the person who moves with purpose and without hesitation is almost always the person who is not surprised. On the evening of August 30th, 1918, one man moved through the chaos of the attempted assassination of Vladimir Lenin with extraordinary calm, extraordinary speed, and extraordinary effectiveness. His name was Yakov Sverdlov. And the story of what he did that night, and crucially, what he had already done before the shots were fired, is the most disturbing thread in the entire tapestry of this investigation. Let us begin with a piece of paper. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, the VTSIK, the supreme governing body of the Soviet state between full congresses, issued an official statement. This was the document that announced the attack on Lenin to the country, characterized it as a counter-revolutionary act of monstrous provocation, identified the socialist revolutionaries as the culpable party, and called upon the revolutionary masses to respond with appropriate force and fury. It was, in effect, the proclamation that launched the Red Terror, the campaign of mass political repression that would, in the weeks and months following, result in the execution of thousands of people across Soviet Russia. This document bore the signature of Yakov Sverdlov. Now here is the problem. Alexander Gill, Lenin's driver, the man who was present at the automobile when the shots were fired, who caught Lenin as he fell, who drove him away from the scene, later gave testimony about the timeline of events that evening. According to Gill, the shooting occurred at approximately 11 o'clock at night. This account is consistent with other witness recollections about when the factory meeting ended and when people began moving toward the vehicles. The official VTSIK proclamation, the one signed by Sverdlov, the one that announced the attack and pointed the finger at the socialist revolutionaries, the timestamps and the internal evidence of its composition and distribution suggest it was prepared with a speed that the timeline cannot accommodate. Consider what the production of such a document requires. Someone must receive definitive information about the event. That information must be processed, confirmed, and transmitted to the relevant authority. The relevant authority must then compose a statement, not a casual note, but a formal proclamation in the specific bureaucratic language of Soviet official communications, one that makes specific factual claims about what happened and who was responsible, one that calls for a specific political response. That statement must then be typed, reviewed, signed, and distributed. In 1918, with no electronic communication, in the middle of the night, in a city on wartime footing, this process takes time. It takes a minimum of several hours to do properly, and a document of this political significance would not have been rushed carelessly. Yet the proclamation existed with a promptness that the sequence of events cannot explain, unless some portion of its preparation had begun before the shots were fired. This is not a trivial anomaly. In criminal investigation, a document that anticipates an event is called prior knowledge. And prior knowledge, in the context of a crime, has a specific and serious meaning. Sverdlov's connection to the events of August 30th does not begin with the proclamation. It begins earlier, with the question of how Lenin came to be at the Michelson factory at all. In the organizational structure of the early Soviet state, public appearances by senior leaders were coordinated through the agitation and propaganda department of the VTSIK, the body that Sverdlov chaired. The assignment of leaders to factories and public meetings, the scheduling of appearances, the logistical arrangements that sent Lenin here rather than there on any given evening, this apparatus ran through Sverdlov's organizational domain. The invitation to speak at the Michelson factory on August 30th came through this channel. Sverdlov was therefore not merely an observer of Lenin's schedule. He was, in the bureaucratic sense, one of its architects. He had visibility into where Lenin would be, at what time, and under what circumstances. He knew the factory. He knew the evening. He knew the arrangements, or in this case, the stunning lack of them. Which brings us to the security question. It is established historical fact that in the days before August 30th, concerns had been raised within the Bolshevik leadership about the security arrangements for public appearances. The political atmosphere was explicitly threatening. The socialist revolutionaries had made no secret of their opposition to the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, which they considered a betrayal of revolutionary principles, and there had been credible intelligence about potential violent actions against Bolshevik leaders. Then, on the morning of August 30th itself, Uritsky was shot dead in Petrograd. The threat level, by any rational assessment, had just escalated dramatically. Proposals were made to increase Lenin's security detail. The suggestion that additional protection should accompany the leader to his evening appearance was raised. Sverdlov rejected it. The precise reasoning offered for this rejection varies across the sources that have examined it, but the outcome is not in dispute. Lenin traveled to the Michelson factory that evening with his driver as his only protection, on a day when a senior Bolshevik official had already been murdered, in a political environment that had been generating credible threats for months. The man who knew Lenin's schedule, the man who controlled the organizational apparatus through which that schedule was set, the man who had the authority and opportunity to ensure adequate security was in place, that man chose not to ensure it. There is a remarkable geographical fact about the evening of August 30th, 1918, that Soviet historians did not dwell upon, and that Western scholars have only gradually assembled into its full significance. At the moment the shots were fired in the courtyard of the Michelson factory, the senior leadership of the Bolshevik Party was distributed as follows. Leon Trotsky, the commander of the Red Army and the second most powerful figure in the Soviet state, was not in Moscow. He was at the front, managing the military campaign of the Civil War. Joseph Stalin, at that point a senior party official and political commissar, was not in Moscow. He was in Tsaritsyn, involved in the southern military operations. Grigory Semyonov, the head of the Petrograd Party organization and a member of the Inner Circle, was not in Moscow. He was in Petrograd. The Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party, the collective body through which power was theoretically exercised, was effectively absent from the capital on the evening when an attempt was made on the life of its most important member. Yakov Sverdlov was in Moscow. Yakov Sverdlov was, in fact, the only senior leader of the Soviet state who was in Moscow, in position, and ready to act when the crisis arrived. And act he did, with the decisiveness and the completeness of a man who had prepared for exactly this scenario. Within hours of the shooting, Sverdlov had effectively assumed control of the state apparatus. He moved into operational command of the government with a fluency that, under the circumstances, can only be described as remarkable. Lenin was incapacitated, unconscious initially, then in serious condition, his long-term survival uncertain for days. The natural response of a leadership structure to such a crisis is confusion, competing claims to authority, the friction of improvised coordination. None of this appears to have troubled Sverdlov. He knew what needed to be done, and he did it. He occupied Lenin's office. This is documented. In the days and weeks following the shooting, as Lenin lay recovering at Gorky, Sverdlov operated from Lenin's workspace in the Kremlin. He managed the correspondence, coordinated the government's functions, and exercised the executive authority of the Soviet state. For several weeks, Yakov Sverdlov was, in practical terms, the ruler of Soviet Russia. Here we must pause and consider the larger political context, because the connection between the shooting on August 30th and what followed is not incidental. It is the point. The Red Terror, formally declared in early September 1918, was the most extensive campaign of political violence that the Soviet state had yet undertaken. Hundreds of prominent political opponents, former Tsarist officials, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, and many people with no clear political affiliation at all, were arrested, imprisoned, and in many cases executed. The Dzerzhinsky secret police was given sweeping new powers and an expanded mandate. The legal constraints on its operations, already minimal, were further reduced. An atmosphere of emergency and retribution was deliberately cultivated and sustained. The official justification for all of this was the attack on Lenin. Someone tried to kill the leader of the revolution. The enemies of the working class have shown their true face. The revolution must defend itself with iron resolve. These were the arguments, and they worked in the sense that they provided the political legitimacy for an enormous expansion of state violence that the Bolsheviks had been seeking ways to justify for months. The Red Terror was not a spontaneous reaction to a shocking crime. It was a prepared response to a prepared event. The proclamation that launched it was ready, suspiciously ready, before the dust had settled in a factory courtyard. The apparatus of repression it activated had been waiting for exactly this kind of triggering event. And the man who set it all in motion was the man who had spent the preceding weeks quietly positioning himself to be the sole competent authority in Moscow when the moment arrived. This is the logic of provocation, one of the oldest tools in the political manipulation handbook. You create or enable an incident. The incident generates fear and outrage. Fear and outrage justify measures that could never have been justified in calmer times. The measures expand your power. The architect of the provocation emerges stronger than before. In this framework, Fanny Kaplan was not the author of the Red Terror. She was its pretext. And the Red Terror's true architect was the man who signed the proclamation, the man who may have written it before she ever approached an automobile in Zamoskvorki. There is a coda to the Sverdlov story that history has never fully explained. In March of 1919, approximately 6 months after the events of August 30th, Yakov Sverdlov died. He was 33 years old. The official cause of death was influenza, attributed to the pandemic that was sweeping Europe and Russia at the time. Lenin delivered a eulogy. Sverdlov was given a hero's burial. His name was inscribed on the honorary list of revolutionary martyrs. But the circumstances of his death generated private questions that some contemporaries recorded in diaries and memoirs that would not see publication for decades. Sverdlov had been the second most powerful man in Soviet Russia. He had demonstrated in the weeks following the shooting an extraordinary capacity for political administration and an even more extraordinary willingness to concentrate authority in his own hands. He had built a network of party appointments and organizational loyalties that gave him leverage across the entire Soviet apparatus. He was, by the spring of 1919, positioned to be Lenin's most formidable rival for long-term dominance of the Soviet state. And then he was gone. Lenin, who had survived 2 bullets in August, lived until 1924. Sverdlov, who had survived nothing more dangerous than a speaking tour in the weeks before his death, did not survive the winter. He fell ill, was treated, and died, quickly without the prolonged decline that influenza typically produced even in its most severe cases during the 1918 to 1919 pandemic period. Some historians have suggested, carefully and with appropriate scholarly hedging, that Sverdlov may have known too much. That the man who had positioned himself so perfectly on the evening of August 30th, who had benefited so completely from Lenin's incapacitation, who carried within his memory the architecture of whatever had actually happened in that courtyard, that this man may have become, by early 1919, precisely the kind of dangerous witness that the Soviet state had already demonstrated it knew how to handle. Fanny Kaplan was burned in a barrel. Yakov Sverdlov was buried with honors. The outcomes were different. The underlying dynamic, the systematic elimination of people who knew too much, may have been the same. Step back from the individual details and look at the shape of what we have assembled. A man with organizational control over Lenin's schedule sent Lenin to a factory meeting without adequate security on the most dangerous day in recent Bolshevik history. That same man had a prepared official proclamation ready to distribute with a speed that the timeline of events cannot honestly explain. That same man was the only senior leader in Moscow when the crisis hit, allowing him to assume control of the state with zero resistance. That same man occupied Lenin's office and exercised Lenin's authority for weeks following the shooting. That same man died within 6 months, under circumstances that the official record describes as unremarkable, but that contemporaries found troubling. At every node in this sequence, Yakov Sverdlov appears, not as a bystander, not as a responder, but as an actor. As someone who shaped events rather than merely reacting to them. The investigation into the shooting at the Michelson factory never asked these questions. The file stayed closed. It could not ask them. Fanny Kaplan remained the official answer, and the official answer was sufficient. You cannot investigate the chairman of the VTSIK as a potential architect of an assassination attempt on Lenin without destroying the legitimacy of the revolution. The entire state apparatus that Sverdlov helped to build. In archives that were eventually opened. In memoirs that were eventually published. In the simple logic of a timeline that, once you examine it honestly, refuses to support the story that was built upon it. The shots at the Michelson factory were the beginning of something. Not the beginning of a lone revolutionary's moment of violent conviction, but the beginning of a carefully prepared political transformation, one that required an act of violence as its foundation and required that the true authorship of that violence never be discovered. Sverdlov was one piece of that architecture, but he was not the only piece. There was another man, the one who was supposed to be hunting for the truth while simultaneously ensuring that the truth could never be found. The head of the Chayka, the night of the revolution. The man who, on the night of the most significant security failure in Soviet history, was not in Moscow at all. Felix Dzerzhinsky had some explaining to do. Every institution has its mythology, and the mythology of the Soviet secret police was built, brick by brick, around one man. Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix, as history would remember him, was the founding director of the Chayka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. He was the architect of the Soviet security state, the man who transformed revolutionary suspicion into bureaucratic machinery, who gave the Bolshevik government its most powerful instrument of internal control. His statue stood for decades in front of the Lubyanka, the Moscow headquarters of the organization he built, until crowds tore it down in August 1991, in the final days of the Soviet Union, as a symbol of everything they were trying to leave behind. In the official mythology, Dzerzhinsky was incorruptible, ascetic, devoted to the revolution with a purity that bordered on the monastic. He slept on a cot in his office. He wore the same leather coat year after year. He believed in what he was doing with a ferocity that his subordinates found simultaneously inspiring and terrifying. He was, in the language that Soviet hagiography preferred, a knight of the revolution, armored in ideological conviction, wielding the sword of proletarian justice against the enemies of the working class. Knights, in the stories we tell about them, do not abandon their post in the middle of a siege. And yet, on the morning of August 30th, 1918, Felix Dzerzhinsky was not in Moscow. He had traveled to Petrograd to personally oversee the investigation into the assassination of Moise Uritsky, the head of the Petrograd Chayka who had been shot dead earlier that day by Leonid Kanagisser. This was, by any measure, a reasonable decision for the head of the National Secret Police to make. A senior colleague had been murdered. Dzerzhinsky went to manage the response. What happened next is where the story stops being reasonable. That evening in Moscow, Shots were fired at Lenin. The leader of the Soviet state was critically wounded. 2 bullets were in his body. His survival was uncertain. The political situation was one of acute emergency. Every organ of state power was on maximum alert. And the head of the secret police, the man personally responsible for the security of the revolution's most important figures, the man whose organization had just catastrophically failed to protect Lenin, was in Petrograd. Fine. He was in Petrograd when it happened. He could not have predicted the precise moment of the attack. His absence from Moscow that evening, while deeply consequential, might be explained by circumstances. What cannot be explained by circumstances is what he did next. Dzerzhinsky did not return to Moscow immediately. Read that sentence again, because it requires full absorption. The head of the Cheka, the chief of Soviet state security, in the immediate aftermath of an assassination attempt on the leader of the Soviet state, did not return to his post. He did not rush back to Moscow to take command of the investigation, to personally oversee the interrogation of Kaplan, to coordinate the security response across the country, to do any of the 100 things that the head of a secret police organization is supposed to do when the most catastrophic security failure in the organization's short history has just occurred on his watch. Instead, following what the historical record describes as advice from Yakov Sverdlov, Felix Dzerzhinsky traveled to Switzerland to visit his wife and son. Let us be precise about the context in which this journey occurred. The summer and autumn of 1918 represented, perhaps the most dangerous period in the entire history of the Bolshevik government. The Civil War was at its most intense phase. The White Armies, backed by foreign intervention forces from more than a dozen countries, were pressing hard on multiple fronts simultaneously. The economy was in a state of catastrophic collapse. Food was being rationed. Cities were being abandoned by their populations as people fled to the countryside in search of something to eat. Political opposition to Bolshevik rule was not merely active, but increasingly violent. The socialist revolutionaries had just, according to the official story, attempted to murder Lenin. The Red Terror had just been formally declared. This was a moment of existential crisis for the Soviet state. Every resource, every capable leader, every experienced administrator was needed at their post, performing their function, contributing to the survival of the revolution. Felix Dzerzhinsky went on vacation. The word vacation feels almost grotesquely inadequate for what the historical record describes, but it is the accurate characterization. Dzerzhinsky traveled to Switzerland, a neutral country, a destination that required crossing multiple borders in the middle of a war, to spend time with his family. His wife, Sophia, and their son were living there. He had not seen them in some time. And Sverdlov, the same man who had rejected proposals to increase Lenin's security, the same man who had a proclamation ready before the ink of events had dried, the same man now sitting in Lenin's office exercising Lenin's authority, had advised Dzerzhinsky to make this journey. Think about that advisory relationship for a moment. The man who most needed to remain in the Soviet Union, who had the most urgent professional reasons to stay, who led the organization that had just suffered its most visible failure, that man took personal advice from the man who had most benefited from the crisis, packed his bags, and left the country. Vladimir Lavrov, doctor of historical sciences and one of the most rigorous scholars to have examined this period in depth, has written about Dzerzhinsky's behavior with a directness unusual in academic historical writing. Lavrov presents exactly 2 explanations for what Dzerzhinsky did, and he presents them not as equally probable alternatives, but as a binary that forces a choice. Either Dzerzhinsky's behavior represents a degree of professional negligence so extreme as to constitute dereliction, an abandonment of duty so fundamental that it defies rational explanation from any conventional perspective. Or Dzerzhinsky knew what was going to happen before it happened, and his absence from Moscow, both before and after the event, was not negligence but design. The night of the revolution either failed catastrophically, or he was never trying to succeed. Consider what was lost by Dzerzhinsky's absence in the critical days following August 30th. Fanny Kaplan was in custody. She was alive. She was being interrogated by junior Cheka officers, capable men, certainly, but not Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the Soviet secret police, the most experienced interrogator in the organization, the man with the broadest understanding of the political landscape and the most sophisticated ability to evaluate what a prisoner was telling him and what they were concealing. That man was not in the room. The interrogations of Kaplan that we have records of are, by the standards of what the Chayka was capable of producing, remarkably thin. She confessed. She maintained that she acted alone, or nearly alone. She provided minimal operational detail. She did not name senior organizers. She did not describe a chain of command that extended upward into any organization's leadership structure. The interrogation, in other words, produced exactly what a managed interrogation is designed to produce: a confession that confirms the desired narrative and nothing beyond it. Would Dzerzhinsky have done better? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Perhaps the outcome was determined before the questioning began, and no interrogator, however skilled, could have extracted a different result from a process whose conclusions were already fixed. But his absence meant that the interrogation was conducted by men who reported upward through a chain of command that, at that moment, terminated in Yakov Sverdlov's temporary occupation of Lenin's office. The organizational logic of who was asking the questions, and who those questioners answered to, pointed in one direction, away from any line of inquiry that might have led somewhere inconvenient. Kaplan was dead in 4 days. The interrogation record was thin. The weapon arrived 3 days late through mysterious hands. And the man who should have been driving the entire investigative process was in Switzerland. Dzerzhinsky's behavior on August 30th did not occur in isolation. It formed part of a pattern that, once identified, extends both backward and forward in time. In the weeks preceding the attack, the Chayka had been receiving intelligence about potential threats to senior Bolshevik officials. The assassination of Uritsky was not a bolt from the clear sky. The political violence of that period was building, documented, and known to the security services. The organization responsible for protecting the revolution's leadership had information suggesting that the threat environment was severe and deteriorating. The response to that intelligence, in terms of security arrangements for public appearances, in terms of the protection details assigned to Lenin and other senior figures, was inadequate in ways that the available evidence does not explain as mere resource constraints or bureaucratic inefficiency. The Chayka was not a small organization by the summer of 1918. It had the personnel. It had the information. What it apparently lacked was the institutional will to act on that information in the specific ways that would have protected Lenin on that specific evening. After the attack, when Dzerzhinsky eventually returned to Moscow, and his return was calibrated, arriving back in the capital only after Lenin himself had recovered sufficiently to return to his office and resume his functions, the investigation proceeded along tracks that never deviated from the official narrative. The socialist revolutionary connection was pursued and documented. The case against Kaplan was consolidated. The evidence anomalies we examined in Part 2 were noted by no one in any official capacity. The investigation found exactly what the investigation was looking for. It looked for nothing else. The question that Lavrov poses, whether Dzerzhinsky's behavior represents failure or foreknowledge, is ultimately a question about what information Dzerzhinsky possessed and when he possessed it. If we accept the foreknowledge hypothesis, the sequence of events becomes coherent in a way that the failure hypothesis cannot achieve. Dzerzhinsky knew that an action was planned for August 30th. He knew that it would be attributed to the socialist revolutionaries. He knew that it would trigger a political crisis that would require the kind of emergency response that the Chayka was positioned to execute. He traveled to Petrograd in the morning, which placed him legitimately outside Moscow when the evening's events unfolded, a geographic alibi built into his schedule. He received Sverdlov's advice to travel further, to Switzerland, which removed him from the immediate environment long enough for the initial investigation to be concluded along the predetermined lines. He returned when the story was set and the witness was Ash. This is a disturbing portrait, and it should be approached with the care that serious historical claims require. We are not asserting, as established fact, that Dzerzhinsky was a knowing participant in an organized conspiracy to wound Lenin and blame it on the socialist revolutionaries. We are doing what responsible investigators do, following the evidence where it points, and noting that it points, with uncomfortable consistency, toward a man who behaved in ways that only make sense if he knew things he could not have known through normal channels. The absence of a definitive document, the smoking memorandum, the signed order, the clear textual proof of coordination, is itself a characteristic of sophisticated operational planning. Organizations that plan sensitive actions do not leave clean paper trails. The very cleanness of the historical record around Dzerzhinsky's role is, paradoxically, part of what makes the foreknowledge hypothesis worth taking seriously. People who know how archives work know how to avoid leaving traces in them. There is a final dimension to Dzerzhinsky's story that the foreknowledge hypothesis illuminates, and it concerns not what he did in August 1918 but what happened to him afterward. If Dzerzhinsky was, in some sense, complicit in what happened at the Michelson factory, if he knew or participated, or simply stepped aside in ways that allowed it to happen, then his position in the years that followed was one of extraordinary vulnerability. He was a man who held a secret of the most dangerous kind, knowledge about the internal mechanics of Soviet power that, if it ever emerged, would destroy not just individuals but the entire ideological foundation of the revolutionary state. Men who hold such secrets in authoritarian systems tend to remain useful precisely as long as they remain complicit, and to become dangerous precisely when their utility expires. Dzerzhinsky died in July 1926, of a heart attack, at the age of 48. He had just delivered a speech to the Central Committee in which he had made enemies on multiple sides of internal party disputes. His health had been deteriorating. The official account is that the physical demands of decades of revolutionary activity, imprisonment, and the extraordinary stress of running the Soviet security state finally caught up with him. He was buried beside Sverdlov in the Kremlin wall. Two men who knew what happened on August 30th, 1918. Both dead before the age of 50. Both given the full honors of the revolutionary pantheon. Both carrying whatever they knew into graves that the Soviet state sealed with considerable thoroughness. The revolution, it turned out, was very good at keeping its secrets. It was even better at keeping the people who held those secrets from ever having the opportunity to share them. By this point in the investigation, we have assembled a picture that bears no resemblance to the official story taught in Soviet textbooks and repeated in Western summaries of the period. We have a shooting in which the supposed perpetrator demonstrably lacked the physical capacity to have fired the shots that were fired. We have an investigation that closed itself before it had properly opened, eliminating its primary witness in 4 days. We have a proclamation that existed before the events it described had fully resolved. We have the head of state security absent from his post and vacationing abroad during the worst crisis of his organization's existence. We have an organization's chairman who was perfectly positioned to benefit from the crisis and who moved immediately and completely to consolidate that benefit. And we have, waiting in the wings, a name that the official story has offered as the link between the Chayka and the socialist revolutionaries. The man who supposedly organized the attack, confessed to organizing the attack, and was rewarded for organizing the attack with a career in Soviet intelligence. Gregory Semyonov. The man whose existence in the historical record poses a question so fundamental that the entire architecture of the official story collapses the moment you ask it clearly. Why does the organizer of an assassination attempt on Lenin end his story not on a prison wall but behind an intelligence desk? The answer to that question changes everything we think we know about the Red Terror, about the early Soviet state, and about the men who built it. There is a specific type of historical figure that conventional narratives struggle to accommodate. A man who appears in the official record as a villain, disappears from punishment as if by magic, and resurfaces on the payroll of the very institution he supposedly attacked. History has a word for this type of figure, a word that intelligence services have used for centuries, a word that cuts through the comfortable mythology of ideological conflict and reveals the cold mechanical reality beneath it. The word is provocateur. And in the story of what happened at the Michelson factory on August 30th, 1918, the provocateur has a name, a face, a published confession, and a career arc so impossible to explain within the official narrative that it functions as a kind of skeleton key, the piece of evidence that, once you hold it in your hands and turn it slowly in the light, unlocks every door that the Soviet state spent decades keeping sealed. His name was Grigory Ivanovich Semyonov. And his story is the most revealing thing in this entire investigation. In 1922, the Soviet state put the Socialist Revolutionary Party on trial. It was one of the first major show trials of the Soviet period, a public proceeding designed to deliver a definitive verdict on the party that the Bolsheviks had been trying to destroy since the consolidation of their power. The trial was internationally observed, extensively documented, and politically calculated to serve as the final nail in the coffin of organized socialist revolutionary opposition. Among the materials produced for this trial was a remarkable document, A published account by Gregory Semyonov, former commander of the Central Combat Detachment of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, in which he described in considerable detail his role in organizing political violence on behalf of that organization, including the attack on Lenin on August 30th, 1918. Semyonov did not offer this account under duress, in the conventional sense. He wrote it. He signed it. He stood behind it in public proceedings. He described the planning, the personnel, the operational decisions that led to the shots in the factory courtyard. He placed himself at the organizational center of the action, not as a peripheral figure or a minor participant, but as the man who made it happen. This confession should have been the end of Grigory Semyonov. In the Soviet Union of 1922, confessing to having organized an assassination attempt on Lenin was not the kind of thing a person did and then went home for dinner. The machinery of Soviet justice, already well-oiled, already experienced in the disposal of enemies real and imagined, was entirely capable of processing such a confession toward its logical conclusion. Semyonov knew this. He was not a naive man. He was an experienced revolutionary operator who had spent years in the brutal world of underground political organization, and he understood perfectly well what confessions meant in the system he was operating within. He confessed anyway. He confessed because he already knew what the outcome would be. Grigory Semyonov was arrested in October 1918, approximately 6 weeks after the shooting. He was held, interrogated, and eventually sentenced. Then he was released. Not after years of imprisonment, not after a lengthy appeal process, not after the political winds shifted in his favor through some complicated factional negotiation. He was released with what the historical record describes as full amnesty, and he emerged from custody to begin a new professional chapter that the official narrative has never been able to explain without tying itself into logical knots. He became a staff officer of Soviet military intelligence. Let us perform a simple calculation, the kind of calculation that any experienced intelligence analyst would perform automatically when examining a case file. A man organizes an assassination attempt on the leader of the Soviet state. He is arrested. He is released. He is given employment in the intelligence services of the Soviet state. He subsequently publishes a detailed confession to the crime for which he was arrested, in the context of a show trial that the Soviet state is using to destroy his former political organization. What does this sequence tell us? It tells us that Semyonov's relationship with Soviet power was not adversarial. It tells us that his value to the Soviet state exceeded whatever debt he theoretically owed for his supposed crimes. It tells us that the people who ran Soviet intelligence, the people who hired him, who vouched for him, who gave him a desk and a salary and an institutional home, were not troubled by his history. They were, in fact, counting on it. In intelligence work, there is a well-established practice of using assets who have criminal histories or politically compromising backgrounds. The compromising background is not a liability, it is a leash. A man who has done something that can be used against him is a man who can be controlled. A man whose public identity is wrapped up in having attacked the Soviet state, but whose private reality is that he works for the Soviet state, is a man who will do what he is told for as long as that arrangement serves the people who hold the file on him. But there is a deeper explanation for Semyonov's trajectory, one that goes beyond mere opportunistic recruitment of a captured enemy. Semyonov was not recruited after the fact. He was operational before the fact. The only way to make sense of Semyonov's post-arrest career is to begin from the conclusion that his post-arrest career demands and work backward to the events of August 30th. If Semyonov was a legitimate socialist revolutionary operator who genuinely organized an attack on Lenin out of ideological conviction, then his subsequent employment in Soviet intelligence is impossible to explain. You do not hire the man who tried to kill your leader. You do not give him access to sensitive state functions. You do not allow him to build a career within the apparatus of the state he attacked. The political logic, the security logic, and the simple human logic of the Bolshevik leadership, men who were not, by any historical account, prone to excessive forgiveness of their enemies, all point in one direction. A genuine organizer of a genuine assassination attempt does not end up with a party card and an intelligence posting. Therefore, Semyonov was not what the official story says he was. The alternative, the explanation that the evidence actually supports, is that Semyonov was, from the beginning, an agent operating within the Socialist Revolutionary Party on behalf of the Chayka or some faction of the Chayka's leadership. His role in the party's combat structures was real, in the sense that he genuinely performed those functions. But the ultimate authority he answered to was not the Socialist Revolutionary Central Committee. It was someone within the Soviet security apparatus. This is not an unusual arrangement. The Chayka's penetration of opposition political parties was extensive and, by the standards of the organization's own documentation, deliberately systematic. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, as the Bolsheviks' most dangerous political competitor, was a primary target for infiltration, placing agents at senior operational levels within enemy organizations, agents who could not only monitor but also influence and direct the activities of those organizations, was standard practice. What was not standard, what represents a level of operational audacity that even within the cynical world of early Soviet intelligence stands out as remarkable, was directing a penetration agent to organize a real action against a senior Bolshevik leader, accepting the genuine risk to that leader's life, in order to generate a political event of sufficient magnitude to justify a transformation of the political landscape. This is what the evidence points toward. Not an assassination attempt that was infiltrated and observed but not prevented. An assassination attempt that was designed from the inside by people who needed it to happen. Semyonov was not alone in his inexplicable survival. Lydia Konopleva was a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Combat Apparatus who worked closely with Semyonov in the period surrounding the August 30th attack. Her precise operational role in the events of that evening has been debated by historians, but her connection to the action and to Semyonov's network is documented. She was arrested. She was tried. She was sentenced. She was released. Like Semyonov, Konopleva emerged from the Soviet justice system not as a broken prisoner granted grudging amnesty, but as someone who subsequently built a functioning life within Soviet institutional structures. Like Semyonov, she avoided the fate that genuine enemies of the Soviet state routinely suffered during this period. Two people, both connected to the central event of August 30th, both arrested, both released, both continuing their lives in a country that was, during this precise period, executing people for crimes considerably less significant than organizing an attempt on Lenin's life. The probability of this outcome occurring twice independently, through the normal operation of Soviet justice, approaches zero. What it looks like, when you examine it without the distorting lens of the official narrative, is a managed outcome. These people were released because the people with authority to release them, the people who controlled the levers of the security apparatus, had reasons to want them free. Those reasons were not humanitarian. They were operational. You protect your assets. You bring them in from the cold when the action is over. You give them new identities within the system and you keep them close, where they remain useful and where they cannot talk to anyone who might be interested in what they know. Semyonov and Konopleva were assets being protected by their handlers. Once you accept the Semyonov hypothesis, once you accept that he was an agent operating within the Socialist Revolutionary Party rather than a genuine member of it acting on genuine ideological conviction, the entire structure of the official narrative about August 30th dissolves. The Socialist Revolutionary connection was not the explanation for the attack. It was the packaging. It was the story that the operation required in order to achieve its political objectives. Think about what the Socialist Revolutionary label accomplished. It provided a ready-made enemy, an organization that the Bolshevik leadership genuinely despised and had been looking for comprehensive justification to destroy. It provided an ideological motive that made intuitive sense to anyone who knew the political landscape. The Socialist Revolutionaries believed Lenin had betrayed the revolution with the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. They had a history of political violence. They were the natural suspects. It provided a narrative of external threat, enemies attacking from outside the Bolshevik family, that was far less destabilizing than the truth, which pointed inward. An attack by the Socialist Revolutionaries was a crisis that could be managed. It could be responded to with force, with the Red Terror, with a campaign of repression that solved several political problems simultaneously. It generated fear and solidarity within the Bolshevik ranks. It justified the expansion of Chayka powers. It gave Sverdlov his emergency authority and his weeks in Lenin's office. It gave the Red Terror its moral foundation. An attack organized from within the Bolshevik security apparatus, using a penetration agent embedded in the socialist revolutionary combat structures, with the prior knowledge of senior party figures. That was a story that could not be managed. That story, if it ever emerged fully formed into the light, would have destroyed everything. So the socialist revolutionary packaging was not merely convenient. It was essential. Without it, the operation had no political utility. With it, the operation delivered everything that its architects required. Grigory Semyonov was shot in 1937. Lydia Konopleva was shot in 1937. The year 1937 occupies a specific and terrible place in the history of Stalin's Soviet Union. It was the peak of the Great Purge, the systematic destruction of a generation of Soviet officials, military officers, intelligence professionals, and party members who had lived through the revolutionary period and carried within their memories the complicated, compromised, and frequently dangerous truths of how the Soviet state had actually been built. Stalin's purges served many purposes, and historians have debated their logic for decades. But one function they unquestionably served was archival. They eliminated people who remembered things. People who had been present at significant events in the early Soviet period. People who knew the difference between the official history and the operational reality. People who had been involved, in one capacity or another, in actions that the Soviet state's carefully constructed mythology could not survive having examined honestly. Semyonov had published his confession in 1922. He had participated in the show trial of the socialist revolutionaries. He had provided exactly the testimony the Soviet state needed at exactly the moment it needed it. For 15 years, he had been a cooperative and presumably well-managed asset within the intelligence structures. And then, in 1937, he was shot. What did Grigory Semyonov know that made him dangerous in 1937? What had he carried for nearly 2 decades that needed to be permanently extinguished, rather than simply managed through continued employment and institutional control? The question answers itself. He knew who had given the orders. He knew whose name appeared at the top of the chain of command for the operation he had run on the evening of August 30th, 1918. He knew the difference between the story he had told in 1922, the story of a socialist revolutionary fanatic acting on ideological conviction, and the story he could have told if the circumstances had ever presented themselves. By 1937, the circumstances had shifted. The people who had protected him were themselves dead or purged. The institutional arrangements that had guaranteed his safety were dissolving. He had become a liability rather than an asset, the last human connection to an operational truth that had been buried for 19 years and could not be allowed to resurface. He was shot. Konopleva was shot. The last living links to the operational reality of August 30th were severed at the source. The revolution protected its secrets with extraordinary thoroughness. It protected them right up until the moment that the archives opened and the documents began to speak for the dead. Step back now and look at the complete picture that Semyonov's story provides. An agent embedded in the socialist revolutionary combat structures organizes an action against Lenin. The action is carried out using a combination of assets. Some genuine socialist revolutionary operatives who believe in what they are doing, some controlled agents who are steering the operation toward a predetermined outcome, and at least one additional figure whose identity and role have never been fully established, who may have fired the shots that Fanny Kaplan could not have fired. The action succeeds in wounding Lenin without killing him, a calibration that suggests either extraordinary luck or careful operational planning, since a dead Lenin would have created an entirely different and far less manageable political crisis than a wounded one. The wounded Lenin generates the crisis required. The crisis generates the Red Terror. The Red Terror generates the political transformation that the architects of the operation needed. The Socialist Revolutionary Party is destroyed as an organized political force. The Chaika's powers are massively expanded. The faction within the Bolshevik leadership that benefited most from the crisis, centered on Sverdlov, connected to the intelligence structures that Dzerzhinsky nominally led but others effectively controlled, consolidates its position. And the agent who made it all possible walks out of custody with a party card and a new career. Fanny Kaplan burns in her barrel. The truth burns with her. Semyonov builds his career in intelligence. carrying his knowledge through 15 years of Soviet institutional life, until the purges come for him and the last ember of operational truth is finally, permanently extinguished. But not completely. Because Semyonov wrote his account. Because archives eventually open. Because the internal logic of a fabricated story contains, always, the seeds of its own exposure. The seeds have been growing for over a century. And now, in the final part of this investigation, we arrive at the question that everything has been building toward. If the socialist revolutionary narrative was cover, if Kaplan was a prop, if Semyonov was an agent, if Sverdlov knew in advance and Dzerzhinsky stepped aside, then who, in that dark courtyard in Zamysk-Voriki, actually pulled the trigger? And what does the answer mean for everything we think we know about the revolution, the Red Terror, and the men who claim to be building a better world? Every investigation reaches a moment of reckoning, the moment when accumulated evidence demands a conclusion that the official mythology cannot survive. We have reached that moment. Fanny Kaplan almost certainly did not fire the shots that wounded Lenin. The investigation was structured to eliminate its primary witness before she could complicate the narrative. The official proclamation existed before the dust had settled in the courtyard. The head of Soviet state security left the country at the precise moment his presence was most urgently required. The man who organized the attack was subsequently employed by the organization he supposedly attacked. All of it points in one direction. The attack on Lenin on August 30th, 1918, was not an external act of political terrorism. It was an internal operation, conceived, planned, and executed from within the Soviet security apparatus, using the Socialist Revolutionary Party as ideological cover and Fanny Kaplan as its human shield. The identity of the actual shooter has never been definitively established. What has been established is that the official shooter could not have done it. Kaplan's visual impairment, the darkness, the moving target within a crowd of hundreds, the ballistics simply do not support her as the primary shooter. Someone else was in that courtyard. Someone trained, someone mobile, someone designed by the operation to disappear into the chaos the moment Kaplan drew the crowd's attention 100 meters away. He succeeded completely. Over a century later, his name remains unknown. He is the ghost at the center of the story, the figure whose presence explains everything and whose identity the entire operation was constructed to conceal. When assembled into a single picture, the operation had 4 requirements, and each one was filled precisely. Someone with authority over Lenin's schedule ensured he traveled to the factory without adequate protection on the most dangerous day in recent Bolshevik history. Sverdlov's organizational domain provided this capability. An ideological cover was needed, a credible enemy to absorb the blame. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, through Semyonov's penetration of its combat structures, provided it. A human face was needed, someone found near the scene who would confess and be eliminated before any formal proceeding could complicate the narrative. Kaplan filled this function, whether she understood her role fully or not. And a prepared political response was needed, the proclamation, the Red Terror, the institutional machinery that would convert the crisis into a consolidation of power. Sverdlov had this ready before the shots were confirmed. Every piece was in place. Every contingency managed. The operation delivered precisely what its architects required. This is the conclusion that changes everything. The Red Terror was not a response to a socialist revolutionary assassination attempt on Lenin. It was a response to an event designed specifically to justify it. Tens of thousands of people were arrested and executed under its authority. Every expansion of Cheka power it justified, every arrest made in its name, all of it rested on a manufactured foundation. The moral emergency that gave the Red Terror its legitimacy was itself a fabrication by the people who benefited most from the measures it justified. The history of the Soviet Union does not begin with revolutionary idealism that gradually darkened. It begins with a deliberate act of internal manipulation, a moment when the architects of Soviet power deceived their own movement to consolidate control. Everything that followed, including the patterns of political violence that Stalin would later expand to industrial scale, was built on that foundation. The people with direct knowledge of what actually happened died within 20 years of the event, with a consistency that the laws of probability struggle to accommodate. Fanny Kaplan, shot and burned within 4 days. No trial, no grave, no record. Yakov Sverdlov, dead at 33, 6 months after benefiting most comprehensively from the crisis. Official cause: influenza. Felix Dzerzhinsky, dead at 48, of a heart attack following a contentious party session. Gregory Semyonov, shot in 1937, when the last people who remembered the operational reality of August 30th were being systematically eliminated. Lydia Konopleva, shot in 1937, same week, same silence. Vladimir Lenin, dead at 53, with a bullet still lodged near his spine, of strokes that the retained fragment may have accelerated across 6 years of slow deterioration. The operation consumed its participants with the thoroughness of a machine designed specifically for that purpose. Because it was. On September 3, 1918, Fanny Kaplan was shot in a Kremlin garage. Her body was burned in a barrel with gasoline to ensure nothing remained, nothing that could be exhumed, examined, or made to yield testimony in any honest proceeding. The thoroughness of that burning tells us everything about how much the people who ordered it feared the truth. But fire cannot burn documents already copied. It cannot destroy the internal logic of a timeline that does not add up. It cannot unwrite the confession of a man who knew too much and put his knowledge on paper. It cannot eliminate the career trajectory of an agent who should have been shot and was instead promoted. The truth survived in the margins, in anomalies, contradictions, impossible careers, and suspicious timings. And the investigation that was never conducted, that the Soviet state made structurally impossible and archivally inaccessible for 70 years. That investigation lives in the questions the evidence refuses to stop asking. Who sent Lenin to the factory without guards? Who wrote the proclamation before the shots were fired? Who advised the head of the secret police to take a vacation in the middle of a national crisis? Who gave the man who organized the attack a party card and an intelligence posting? And who, in the darkness of that courtyard, raised a weapon and fired 3 times at the most important man in Russia? The barrel is cold. The archive is open. The truth is still waiting to be found.